Motherhood had always been something I longed for, but nothing could prepare me for the journey ahead. Since Ethan's birth, he was different, not in a bad way, but in a way I couldn't define. His brown eyes seemed to search for something beyond, as if he saw a world I couldn't access. He didn't speak much, but there was an intensity in his gestures, as if each movement was carefully calculated. In the early years, people reassured me. "He's just shy," they'd say, or "boys take longer to talk." I wanted to believe that, but small signs began to emerge. He was fascinated by patterns, lining up toys, organizing objects by color or size. He didn't like changes. If we moved something in his room, he reacted with frustration. These differences began to draw attention outside of home. On a trip to the park, while other children played together, Ethan sat next to a row of leaves on the ground and began to rearrange them, as if creating a work of art. The turning point came at a friend's son's birthday party. The party was loud and full of lights. As soon as we entered, Ethan grabbed my hand tightly, his eyes fixed on the ground. "Is he okay?" my friend asked. "Yes," I lied. But as the music grew louder and the lights started to flash, Ethan began to cry. He covered his ears and ran to the door, shouting. I followed him, ignoring the confused and judgmental looks. Outside, I sat on the floor with him. He was trembling, his hands still over his ears. "It's okay, my love," I said, stroking his hair. He looked at me with tears in his eyes, but without words. It was as if he wanted to tell me something, but couldn't. That night, at home, while Ethan slept, I felt a weight on my chest. I searched the internet until dawn, child sensitive to noise, reactions to flashing lights. The information was vague, but one word appeared repeatedly: autism. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew I needed answers. I made an appointment with Dr. Sarah Bennett, a child development specialist. During the first sessions, she observed Ethan playing, interacting, or rather, not interacting, with those around him. When she finally called me in to talk, her tone was gentle, but direct. "Megan, based on what I've observed and what you've told me, I believe Ethan is on the autism spectrum. This means he processes the world in a unique way." My head spun as she explained. She talked about the spectrum, about how each child is different. Autism isn't a limitation. It's just a different way of seeing and connecting with the world. I left her office with a mix of emotions: relief for finally understanding what was happening, fear of what this meant for the future, and above all, a growing determination to do whatever it took to help Ethan. After the diagnosis, I plunged into a whirlwind of research and learning. Sleepless nights became common as I read about the autism spectrum. Each article, each video, each forum was an attempt to decipher what it meant to be a mother to a child like Ethan. I discovered that autism was a universe in itself, full of nuances. It wasn't a condition with a one-size-fits-all solution. Some children had communication difficulties, others had extreme sensory sensitivities. Some displayed remarkable talents in specific areas. I began to observe Ethan with new eyes, trying to identify what made him shine. One day, while he was playing with his building blocks, something caught my attention. He wasn't just building a tower. He was arranging the blocks in a symmetrical pattern, with colors and shapes that seemed to make sense to him, but not to me. When I turned on the digital piano in the living room, he stopped, looked at the blocks, and rearranged them, as if the notes of the music were influencing his creation. Curious, I sat at the piano and played a simple melody. He approached, watching closely. After I finished, he pointed to the keys. "Do you want to try?" I asked. Ethan nodded. He pressed the keys carefully, mimicking the melody I had played. It wasn't perfect, but the precision with which he captured the rhythm was impressive. At the next consultation, I shared this with Dr. Bennett. "Music can be a powerful channel for him," she said. "Many children on the spectrum have a deep connection with patterns and sounds. Perhaps you found his path." At the same time, I faced internal challenges. There were days when I felt overwhelmed, unsure. Was I doing enough? Was I understanding my son in the way he needed? Michael, my husband, dealt with the situation differently. He avoided the subject whenever possible. "We don't need to label Ethan," he said. "He's just a kid. Maybe all of this is temporary." I knew it wasn't, but I avoided discussing it. We were on different paths, and I didn't know how to reconnect. For now, my focus was on Ethan and figuring out how to help him navigate a world that seemed intent on not understanding him. When it came time to enroll Ethan in school, I knew we would face challenges. I wanted to believe he could thrive in a conventional environment, where he could interact with other children and learn from them. But deep down, I felt the weight of the educational system, which was rarely prepared to embrace children like Ethan. The initial meeting was cordial, but laden with subtext. The principal, an experienced woman, smiled gently as I explained Ethan's needs. "We are committed to inclusion," she said, in a tone that seemed more rehearsed than sincere. Ethan's first days at school were complicated. During the first week, I received a call from the teacher. Ethan refused to participate in the group activity, she explained. He preferred to stay alone, lining up blocks in the corner of the room. "Is that normal for him?" "Yes," I responded, trying not to sound defensive. "He likes patterns. Maybe you could use that to engage him." But, it seemed, the teacher didn't know how to deal with Ethan. He had difficulty following conventional instructions, and this seemed to irritate some of the other kids. During an art class, when the children were asked to draw a house, Ethan covered his sheet with circles and symmetrical lines. The teacher tried to redirect him, but he became frustrated and threw his pencil on the floor. In a meeting with the parents, I noticed that some were beginning to question Ethan's place in the class. "I don't want to sound insensitive," one mother said, clearly trying to sound exactly that, "but wouldn't he be better off in a more appropriate school?" Each word felt like a blow. I felt isolated, as if I were fighting against an entire system. But amid all of this, something unexpected happened. One day, I picked Ethan up early and found him sitting in the corner of the music room, with a small keyboard in front of him. He was pressing the keys carefully, creating a simple, yet enchanting melody. The music teacher, a middle-aged woman with attentive eyes, saw me watching. "He has something special," she said. "Music seems to connect with him in a way that other methods can't. Have you considered exploring this?" That night, I reflected on her words. Maybe the school wasn't ready for Ethan, but music was. As Ethan faced challenges at school, tension at home began to rise. Michael, though loving, seemed paralyzed by the diagnosis of our son. He didn't know how to react, so he chose silence. "Do you think we're doing enough for him?" I asked one night, while filling out forms for school support. Michael sighed. "I think we're overdoing it. Maybe he just needs time. I don't want him growing up thinking he's different." I stayed silent for a moment, carefully choosing my words. "He is different, Michael. And that's not a bad thing. The problem isn't Ethan. It's the world that doesn't know how to handle him. I don't want people treating him specially," he countered. "I want him to be treated like everyone else." "But he's not like everyone else," I responded, my voice a little louder than I intended. "And ignoring that won't help him." Michael stood up, frustrated. "I just don't want him to suffer, Megan. Do you think it's easy for me to accept this? To see my son struggle with things that should be simple?" I left him alone in the room, feeling a mix of anger and sadness. I understood Michael's fear, but I couldn't let him stop us from moving forward. Things got worse at school. The teacher called me for a meeting, where she reported that Ethan was disrupting the class's progress. I listened in silence as she spoke about her difficulty in dealing with him, but my patience reached its limit when she suggested that maybe Ethan should be transferred to another environment. "Are you saying he's not capable of learning here?" I asked, trying to control my anger. "That's not it," she replied, uncomfortable. "It's just that maybe he needs more attention than we can offer." That night, I cried on the couch. Ethan appeared with one of his favorite blocks and placed it beside me. He didn't say anything, but his presence was enough to remind me why I was fighting. It dawned on me then that this battle wasn't just for Ethan. It was for all the children who, like him, were seen as a burden instead of a gift. Amid the struggles with school and the tension at home, music became a sanctuary. Since discovering Ethan's interest in the keyboard in the music room, I decided to invest more in this connection. He seemed to find a sense of calm and purpose in the keys, as if each note were an extension of his own thoughts. I enrolled him in music classes at a small local studio. When we arrived for his first lesson, the environment was welcoming, with walls covered in sheet music and instruments carefully organized. The teacher, Mr. Harrison, was a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a warm smile. "So, Ethan, let's start slow," he said, moving carefully to avoid startling him. Ethan didn't respond, but watched closely as Mr. Harrison played a simple melody. "Want to give it a try?" the teacher asked. Ethan hesitated, but moved toward the keyboard. He pressed the keys slowly, recreating the melody with an impressive accuracy for someone who had never received formal instruction. Mr. Harrison looked at me, visibly surprised. He has an incredible sensitivity to music. He listens in a way few people can. Over the weeks, these lessons became a refuge for both Ethan and me. He flourished in the small studio, where expectations were flexible and he could explore his creativity. His compositions began to take shape, small fragments that, though they didn't follow any conventional structure, were captivating. At home, Ethan spent hours at the piano, creating unique patterns. Sometimes, I sat beside him, trying to keep up with his ideas. "Are you telling a story, Ethan?" I asked once, curious about his musical choices. He didn't respond with words, but his melody shifted, as if to say, yes. Music became a bridge between us, a language that transcended the barriers that often seemed impossible to overcome. And, for the first time in months, I felt truly connected to my son. Despite Ethan's progress in music, the problems at school continued to escalate. At every meeting, I heard the same complaints: he doesn't follow the classroom rules. He struggles to relate to his peers. Maybe a more specialized environment would be better for him. It was during one of these meetings that the principal finally became more direct. "Megan, we want the best for Ethan. But perhaps a specialized school could offer the support he truly needs. Here, we simply don't have the resources to meet his needs." I left the meeting with a heavy heart. Admitting that conventional school wasn't the right place for Ethan somehow felt like a defeat. But at the same time, I knew that continuing to insist on this environment was causing more harm than good. When I talked to Michael about it, he was, as always, reluctant. "Do you think it's a good idea to take him out of school? What if that only makes him isolate even more?" I sighed, trying to contain my frustration. "Michael, he's already isolated. Not by his choice, but because the system isn't prepared for him. We need to think about what's best for him, not what seems best for us." Michael shook his head, defeated. "I just want him to be happy." "I do too," I responded. "And sometimes, happiness means finding a place where he can be himself without feeling wrong all the time." After many nights of discussing and planning, we decided to enroll Ethan in a specialized program. The new school was smaller, with reduced class sizes and teachers trained to understand the needs of neurodiverse children. On his first day, when I dropped him off in the classroom, I was greeted by a teacher who immediately knelt down to Ethan's level and said, "Welcome, Ethan. I'm so glad to have you here." When I returned to pick him up at the end of the day, he seemed more relaxed than ever. He showed me a drawing he had made, not of houses or trees, but with lines and circles that connected in a harmonious way. "I made this," he said with a small smile. In that moment, I knew we had made the right choice. Even though it meant financial sacrifices and criticism from friends and family, nothing was more important than seeing Ethan finally thrive. It was during a routine consultation with Dr. Bennett that a new possibility arose. We were talking about how Ethan was thriving at his new school and in his music lessons when she casually mentioned something that would change our lives. "Megan, did you know there's a young music talent competition in the city? I think Ethan should participate." My first reaction was hesitation. The idea of putting Ethan on stage, in front of an audience, seemed terrifying. Not for him, but for me. I knew how cruel the world could be toward what it doesn't understand. Do you think he's ready for something like this? I asked, uncertain. Dr. Bennett smiled. He's already ready. The competition is just an opportunity to show that to the world. It's not about winning, Megan. It's about allowing him to express himself. Back home, I watched Ethan as he plucked a melody on the piano. The music seemed to flow from him like an extension of his being. I decided that maybe it was time to let him shine, even if it meant stepping out of my comfort zone. That night, I sat beside him at the piano. Ethan, there's an event where kids play music. Would you like to participate? He didn't respond with words, but began playing a new melody, one that seemed full of emotion. To me, that was a yes. The following weeks were dedicated to preparation. We worked with Mr. Harrison to create something unique that would highlight Ethan's abilities. But he insisted on composing his own piece. His compositions were unconventional, full of unpredictable changes in rhythm, but there was a beauty in them that only he could create. Do you think he'll be able to do it? I asked Mr. Harrison as we watched Ethan play. I think he'll surprise us all, the teacher replied, with a confident smile. Meanwhile, I was dealing with my own nervousness. What if people didn't understand? What if he felt pressured? But every time I watched Ethan at the piano, his light hands creating worlds of sound, those doubts faded away. The day of the competition came too quickly. I was a whirlwind of emotions, nervousness, pride, fear. Ethan, on the other hand, seemed calm as he carefully adjusted his tie before we left the house. The auditorium was filled with talented kids and their parents, all in a mix of anxiety and excitement. Ethan watched everything with that curious, attentive gaze that was so characteristic of him. When they called him backstage, he held my hand, but not like someone who was nervous. It was a gesture of connection, as if to say, I know you're here with me. When it was his turn, my heart raced. He walked to the stage calmly, sat at the piano, and for a moment, the auditorium fell silent. He looked at the audience, then at me, and then began to play. The music he composed was like a conversation, a dialogue between notes and emotions. It started soft, almost shy, but soon gained strength, playing with rhythms and patterns that defied conventions. Each note seemed to tell a story, one that only Ethan could narrate. As he played, I watched the audience. At first, some people seemed confused, perhaps trying to understand the complexity of the music. But as the piece went on, something changed. The silence in the room became deep, almost reverent, as if everyone was being transported to Ethan's world. When the last note echoed in the air, there was a moment of pause. Then, a wave of applause erupted, and some people even stood up. I felt tears streaming down my face. It wasn't just because of Ethan's performance, but because for a few minutes, he had shown the world just how unique and brilliant he was. Backstage, I hugged Ethan tightly. You were amazing, my love, I whispered. He didn't say anything, but his small smile told me everything I needed to know. In that moment, I realized that it didn't matter what came next. Ethan had already won, not a competition, but something much bigger. He had touched hearts, and that was more powerful than any trophy. The morning after the competition, while we were having breakfast, my phone began to vibrate incessantly. Messages, notifications, and calls flooded the screen. One of the judges had shared the video of Ethan's performance on social media, and it was quickly spreading. Emotional comments began to appear. I've never seen anything so unique. This child is incredible, and my daughter is also on the spectrum. Thank you for showing the world the talent of these children. The impact was overwhelming, and even though Ethan remained unaware of the attention, I knew something important was happening. Over the following days, messages from parents started pouring in. Some shared stories about their own children, struggling with prejudice. Others asked for advice, wanting to know how we made our decisions regarding school and music lessons. I was invited to attend a meeting with the competition organizers. When I arrived, they were visibly excited. "Megan, Ethan's performance taught us something important," one of the coordinators said. "We want to create a new category in the competition, dedicated to creativity and originality, especially for children with different learning styles." Hearing this moved me deeply. What Ethan had done was much bigger than just playing a piece of music. He had changed perspectives, inspired empathy, and perhaps even started to transform the world for other children like him. Meanwhile, Ethan remained the same, calm, focused on music and his creative explorations. He spent hours at the piano, creating melodies that seemed like little wordless stories. Sometimes, I sat beside him, just listening, in awe of his ability to transform feelings into sound. One day, while he was playing, I decided that I needed to do more. Not just for him, but for all the children who, like Ethan, had unique talents and weren't understood by the world. It was then that an idea began to take shape. The idea came to me like a flash. What if I could share Ethan's story on a broader scale? Not just to inspire other parents, but to show the world what it means to be neurodiverse? I talked to Dr. Bennett about it. "What if we make a documentary?" I asked, excited. "Something that shows how Ethan uses music to express himself and explores the creativity of other children on the spectrum?" Dr. Bennett's eyes lit up. "That would be incredible, Megan. You could open so many doors and change so many perceptions. Ethan's story is powerful." And so, I began to plan. I reached out to parents, teachers, and musicians who worked with neurodiverse children. Ethan was my starting point, but the idea was to create something bigger, something that would show how autism could be a bridge to extraordinary forms of expression. The first footage was shot at home, with Ethan at the piano. He didn't mind the cameras, completely immersed in his music. In one scene, I asked him while he was playing, "What are you thinking, Ethan?" He didn't answer with words, but changed the tone of the melody, turning it into something lighter, almost playful. As we edited the footage, I began to realize the impact the project was already having. The sound technician, who had been skeptical at first, turned to me after a session and said, "I've been working with music for years, but I've never heard anything so pure. Your son has a gift." When the documentary was finished, we organized a screening at a small local theater. Parents, teachers, and community members came to watch. At the end of the session, the room was filled with silence before being broken by applause. Some people came up to me, tears in their eyes, thanking me for sharing our journey. In that moment, I knew this was just the first of many stories I wanted to tell. Ethan had paved the way, and I was determined to follow it. As we headed home, Ethan looked at me and said softly, "It was good, Mommy." Those words, so simple, carried a tremendous weight. He knew we were building something together, and that filled me with pride. Ethan's journey was just beginning, but one thing was certain: the world was finally listening to his music.